Welcome to another lecture of Introduction to Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about cognitive or intellectual development. Below is your dad joke of the day. Did you hear about the cheese factory that exploded? There was nothing but debris. So we're going to be focusing on how intellectual or cognitive development occurs or transitions through childhood. That's not to say that cognitive development does not persist beyond childhood, but that's what we're going to be focusing on since a lot of the research about cognitive development has focused on infancy and childhood. And as children get older, it's important to keep in mind that they're gaining a lot of skills, but they're also losing some skills. So as a college student or as an adult, you probably have a lot more skills than a child. And yet, things like imaginative play is something that children have, but we as adults or young adults may no longer have. Children, unfortunately, are a little bit difficult to study, unlike adults that we can administer surveys to and ask questions of. It's not that easy when studying children. So, for example, they might misunderstand questions that we're asking, or their responses might be misunderstood by us simply because we understand the world differently than children sometimes do. And our understanding of how kids think, so child cognition, has changed as the way in which we've chosen to study them have gotten to be more clever. And so depending on how kids are studied, the conclusions about their abilities can vary, right? So really, our understanding of childhood cognition is influenced largely by the techniques that are used to study them. So there are 3 different research designs typically used to study development, and we're going to go through each one of these. Each of them has benefits and drawbacks that we're going to be kind of highlighting through this slide. The first one's called cross-sectional design. Cross-sectional design, what you're essentially doing with this design is you're getting groups of people of different ages and studying them at the same time. So we're getting a cross-section of the population. We're kind of taking a slice through the population by studying people of all different ages at one given time to see how they might differ in their abilities or their thinking. An example of a cross-sectional design would be comparing reading ability across kiddos that are 6, 8, and 12 years of age. The problem with cross-sectional designs is that you may encounter something called cohort effects. Cohort effects, which we'll talk about in the next slide, don't represent developmental differences, but rather represent differences across the eras in which people were raised, generational differences, in other words. And so it's not that big a deal if you're studying kiddos that are, within 6, 7 years apart from each other. But if we're studying individuals that are decades apart, the society or culture that they may have grown up in might be different than those that they're being compared to. But we'll talk about cohort effects in the next slide. Longitudinal designs is another option. So longitudinal design starts off with somebody or groups of people of the same exact age, but then we bring them back as they reach specific ages to study them. So we're doing follow-ups on the same individuals that started the study. So if we were using the same example that I did in cross-sectional design, comparing reading ability, to make that into a longitudinal design, we would compare reading ability of a group of individuals when they're 6, bring them back 2 years later, study them when they're 8, bring them back again 4 years later and study them when they're 12. One of the major problems of longitudinal designs is something called selective attrition. Selective attrition happens when you have, the study continuing on for many, many years. People just drop out of the study. And so the people you are left with may be or may contain or have a unique characteristic that may interfere or serve as what's called a confound to what it is you're trying to study, because you're trying to study the general population when you start the study, but based on who you're left with, you may no longer be studying the general population. And so because longitudinal designs are so lengthy and time-consuming, that people sometimes drop out. And then who you're left with no longer represents the population, and so you can't be sure that what you are finding actually applies to the general population. A good kind of combo of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs is sequential designs. So in this particular study, you start off with people of different ages, but then you follow up on all of them, at different time points. So it's combining all of the benefits of longitudinal and cross-sectional designs into one, getting rid of some of the downsides of the other two research designs. And so to kind of get back at cohort effects, which you're more likely to see in cross-sectional designs, they represent effects that seem developmental, but they're not developmental. Rather, they represent the time period in which the individuals may have grown up in. So for example, how much skin women are allowed to show in bathing suits has changed a lot based on the turn of the century in, the 1900s versus now, right? So if you ask people their opinions on how much skin a woman should show in bathing suits, depending on the era in which they were raised, they might feel very differently about this particular question. So it might not represent developmental effects, but rather effects related to the time period in which they grew up. Okay, so those are the different designs that we can use to study people as they go through development. Let's talk about some things that psychologists have discovered about infancy cognition. When you present infants with images, so infants don't do much besides, sleep, poop and pee, and eat. They don't have language, they can't communicate other than crying. But what we can do is we can look and see how long they spend looking at an image, right? So what they've done in this particular study is they're looking to see the percentage of time infants spent staring at each of these images. So they presented them with something that looks somewhat like a face, something with concentric circles, something that has newsprint, just plain old white, just plain old yellow, and red. What they found, if you look here and you can read this graph, infants spend a lot more time looking at drawings that resemble something that look like human faces compared to anything else. And so this suggests that infants have a preference for human faces. And that's not so surprising because we have an entire area of our brain called the fusiform face area that is designated solely for recognizing and looking at faces. And so we preferentially are wired to look for faces and stare at faces longer. But what's interesting is what a newborn's concept of a face is very simplistic. It's just an oval with something that resembles eyes, nose, and a mouth centered in the middle. So if you look at these two images, you would recognize that they're not the same person or face. Something's changed when you compare this first image to the second one. What's really interesting is a 4-year-old is not able to distinguish differences between these two. They would say that these two images are exactly the same. However, a 6-year-old would notice the difference. So what this tells us is something changes between the ages of 4 and 6, where the distinction, the ability to distinguish between facial features is occurring. Like they're able to do it at 6, but not at 4. Another thing that psychologists have studied, again, because infants don't do much, is infants' hearing. So I'm going to introduce 2 concepts to you, and then I'll explain to you how they were studied in infants. Because again, infants don't have language, so it's really hard to study what they hear differently from others. So habituation is this idea of no longer paying attention to a stimulus that doesn't change. So ignoring a stimulus that is constant, right? So right now you've probably have habituated to the sounds in the room that you're in, to the clothes that you're wearing, to whatever it is that you're sitting on. Those things have not really changed much, so you have stopped paying attention to them. You kind of ignore that they're even there. Dishabituation is noticing that a response that was constant has changed in some way. So dishabituation is paying attention to a previously habituated stimulus. Okay, so hopefully you understand that, and I'm going to illustrate to you what I mean by habituation and dishabituation in this particular study that they did with infants. So again, infants don't talk, but what they do is they're really good at sucking on a pacifier or a nipple. Scientists have attached the pacifier to a measuring device that allows them to measure how many sucks per minute an infant makes on that pacifier or nipple. So what you're looking at in this first bar is the normal sucking rate of an infant without any stimulus present. So about 25 sucks or 28 sucks a minute, excuse me. Then when they present the sound ba, and that's again repeatedly just ba, 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 the infant notices the sound being presented, and so it increases its sucks. And so this suggests that infants are kind of using suckling as a way to demonstrate interest. If they're interested or curious, they'll suckle more. If they're less interested, less curious, they'll suckle less. And so when the sound ba was presented, the infant suckled about 52 sucks per minute, which is a lot. But after 5 minutes of playing the sound ba and having it not change, they showed a decrease in response to the sound, right? And so this represents habituation. Habituation is when there's a decrease in response to a stimulus that is unchanged. Then the scientists changed the sound from ba to pa, right? There are different letters. And what they noticed when they shifted ba to pa, they produced an increase in sucks again. This told the scientists or psychologists one thing, that infants can distinguish between the sounds of ba and pa. So it's interesting because it's during infancy that language develops. So the brain learns to hear different sounds within the infant's primary language or languages, and those sounds tend to kind of get hardwired because when you're an adult and if you're hearing or trying to hear sounds of a language that is not part of yours, you will likely have a difficult time hearing the differences. Psychologists have also used sucking techniques to study learning and memory in infants. So I mentioned this already. Newborns suckle more vigorously when they're interested in something, and so they sucked more vigorously when they heard a recording of their own mother's voice than that of some random woman. So this suggests they have a preference to mom's voice, and also that they recognize the sound of their mom's voice, something that they learned when they were in utero in their mom's belly. Another study that I think is incredibly clever to illustrate learning and memory in infants, at just 2 months old, the psychologists taught the infants to activate this mobile. So I don't know if you know what a mobile is. It's the thing that hangs over an infant's crib to kind of keep it entertained so that when it wakes up from a nap or is just laying there, it is occupied and mom or dad can take a break. But anyway, in this particular study, there was a ribbon attached to the mobile that controlled its on-off switch. And infants were taught that by moving their leg, which the ribbon was tied to, they could activate the mobile, right? So they learned to kick and activate the mobile. And what was incredible is that several days later, when they were tested for this, the 2-month-old infants knew exactly what to do with the ribbon tied around their foot, right? So this illustrates that learning and memory forms in infants as young as 2 months of age. So I want to introduce you to somebody who kind of recognized that children just saw the world differently. This is Jean Piaget. He was initially studying intelligence, so he was administering intelligence tests, but he noticed that children really just thought of the world differently. And he noticed that children of different ages were able to do some things and not others. And so he devised 4 stages of intellectual development that we still teach today. And these stages of intellectual development, I would say, are not set in stone. There's a lot of fluidity between the transitions of these stages. But here are the 4 major stages of intellectual development that we're going to expand on in the next few slides. Sensory motor stage occurs from birth to about 1.5 years of age, and we'll talk about what that involves. Pre-operational stage occurs from about 1.5 to 7 years. From about 7 to 11, we're in the concrete operation stage, and then finally, from 11 years onward, we're in the formal operation stage. So let's take a look at what is happening developmentally in each of these Piaget stages. So the sensory motor stage is roughly from birth to about 1.5 years of age, a little bit more than that. It's called sensory motor because really at this stage, infants are just reacting to the things that they detect by moving in some way. So they're just reacting to sensory stimuli through reflexes and other reactions. They don't have language at this time, and they don't recognize what is called, or what is known as object permanence. So object permanence is this idea that even in the absence of our ability to see an object, it continues to exist. So here's an infant about 6 months old that is shown a stuffed animal, and it looks interested in the stuffed animal, but as soon as a barrier is placed in front of that infant, it loses interest. A child not in the sensory motor stage, so probably about 2 years of age, would attempt to reach around the barrier, recognizing that despite the fact that they're not able to see the object, it still continues to exist. The other piece that's kind of missing at this sensory motor stage is a sense of self. If we were to apply, a dot to a child's face and put them in front of a mirror, they would likely reach out to the mirror and not themselves. They don't necessarily recognize that the person that they're seeing in the mirror is themselves and that the dot is on them. Right? So they lack a sense of self at this stage, at the sensory motor stage. Pre-operational stage starts where the sensory motor stage ends. So again, it's fluid, but at this stage, language starts to develop and they're able to represent objects mentally as words or other symbols. They tend to respond to objects that are remembered, but they don't have to necessarily be present, right? So they recognize object permanence. The limitations of this stage is that they lack the ability to operate, and we'll talk about what some of these are. So they also lack something called concept of conservation. They focus on one aspect of the property of an object at a time, so length or width. They can't do both at once, and they have trouble distinguishing appearance from reality. So we'll expand on each of these in the coming slides. One of the things that this particular stage also demonstrates, and it's not necessarily a good thing, is called egocentrism. So egocentrism is not selfishness, but it's the lack of recognition that their view of the world is different from those of others. They tend to view the world only from their perspective and assume that everybody else is experiencing the world just like they are. So, for example, when my daughter was younger, she would watch a show and she would talk to somebody she had just met and assume that they had already seen this show and start talking to them about it, right? So this represents egocentrism. It's not necessarily selfishness, but rather a perspective that is limited to their view only. Egocentrism, a lack of it, of perspective, is related to theory of mind. Theory of mind is something that kiddos at the stage lack, but it's something that they're gradually developing in this stage. And theory of mind represents the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. So because they lack the ability to recognize that other people have a different perspective from their own, they're definitely not able to see something from somebody else's perspective besides their own. We can test theory of mind by using this particular vignette. So in this vignette, we would present it to a child to test their theory of mind. Are they able to put themselves in the shoes of one of these two individuals? So here's the vignette. First, Sally has a black box, Anne has a white box. Sally has a white marble that she places into her box. And then Sally leaves and goes for a walk. Anne, being the naughty girl that she is, takes the marble out of Sally's box and puts the white marble in her own box. Anne leaves. Sally comes back and wants to play with her marble. Where would she look for that marble? Kiddos without theory of mind would say the white box, because that's where they saw the marble last. They are not able to put themselves in Sally's shoes and recognize that the last time Sally saw the marble was when she put it in her black box. Kiddos with theory of mind, and hopefully all of you, were able to correctly answer that Sally would look in the black box, which is where she had it last. Kiddos in the pre-operational stage also have difficulty distinguishing appearance from reality, so they don't necessarily recognize that, larger objects can be represented as models. So in this particular test, a 2.5-year-old is shown a small room, like a model of a room, where a stuffed animal is placed behind a pillow. Then the child is placed into a room, identical to the model, but she doesn't know that. And she's asked to find that stuffed animal. She's not able to. But part of realizing or being able to test a child's ability to distinguish appearance from reality depends on how we're asking the question. So when we just show them this model and expect them to find the stuffed animal in the larger room, she may not be able to find it. But if we tell the child that here is a tiny, tiny room, here a stuffed animal is hidden behind it, but then we used a fancy machine where it expands this tiny room into a big one, and then placed the child into that room, they would successfully find that stuffed animal. So how we ask the child about kind of representation versus reality kind of helps us or dictates whether the child is able to successfully distinguish appearance from reality. Another feature that is lacking in the pre-operational stage is concept of conservation. It's the understanding that objects do not change in properties like number, length, volume, area, and mass, despite the fact that they might change in shape and arrangement. So we can test children to demonstrate that they have a lack of concept of conservation or whether they have it. A child in the pre-operational stage would argue that these 2 rows of pennies are the same, but that these 2 rows of pennies are different, that the one on the bottom is more or has more pennies than the top row because the bottom row is taking up more space. Similarly, if we showed a child 2 beakers with identical amounts of liquid and then took the contents of one beaker and placed it in a graduated cylinder that's taking up more space, the child would say that this object has more volume because it is taller, taking up more space than the one in the beaker, despite them having exactly the same space. Again, lastly, these two are identical, but we kind of mash up this one. They would say that this one is heavier compared to the one on the right because it's taking up more space. And here's a picture of the author testing his son exactly for concept of conservation while his son was in the pre-operational stage. In the concrete operation stage, which is the next one in Piaget's stages of intellectual development, this stage occurs from 7 to 11 years. They have all of the abilities that the pre-operational stage lack. They understand the concept of conservation. They can reason logically. They have language. They have theory of mind. But what they lack in this particular stage is things with abstract concepts or hypothetical situations. They're not able to kind of imagine circumstances that they themselves have not been in, or circumstances that might be different than what they know to be true. The formal operation stage, which is kind of 11 years on, at this point, a child can do pretty much everything that an adult can, but the only thing that they're lacking at this stage is knowledge, right? They have not gained enough knowledge at 11 years of age, and so that's what they're really amassing, but their ability, what they are able to understand intellectually, is the same at 11 years old as it is at the adult stage. Now, I wanted to show you this video, but I don't think it's going to work, so instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to this video which really nicely illustrates some of these concepts that we talked about in Piaget's stages. I'll put it in the description of this video, but I would encourage you to watch it just because it's super fun to watch these children making some of those mistakes that they do at the different stages because they are unable to fully understand intellectually what is happening around them. So developmental psychologists have argued that perhaps Piaget's stages aren't really distinct, and this is kind of what Piaget argued. He argued that at each stage, a child needs to discover on their own these elements of intellectual development before they can progress to the next stage. And so he's viewed intellectual development as this kind of stepwise, sudden change where the child goes from one stage to the other. However, most psychologists recognize that development is much more gradual. It is not a stepwise perspective. And so they see development as gradual and continuous, which is contrary to what Piaget kind of believed and argued. Another critic of Piaget is Vygotsky. So Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who kind of argued against Piaget's idea that kids have to discover or wait to discover concepts on their own. And so Vygotsky argued that kiddos can be taught things that are kind of beyond their abilities with some help, and that they shouldn't wait for these, for themselves to learn on their own, that educators should kind of guide and help children to learn principles of things that might be challenging for their particular age. And so he came up with this idea called zone of proximal development. Zone of proximal development represents the distance between what a child can do on their own and what a child can do with some help and guidance. To visually illustrate the zone of proximal development, here's kind of a chart. The center circle represents something a child can do independently. The outer circle represents something that children can't do even with help. But then you have this middle circle that a child with help is able to do. And this is the zone of proximal development. The area where a child can't really do things on their own, but with help can definitely master it or get better at it faster. So that's it for this lecture. And here are your exit ticket questions. I just wanted to point out for number 1, it doesn't matter what kind of developmental feature you choose to study. It can be reading, it can be writing, it can be riding a bike, whatever you want. But what I want you to do in this particular exit ticket question is describe what each of the designs we discussed, how they would be structured if you were to be studying that developmental feature you've chosen. Okay, so you're not going to try to combine these designs together. You're going to describe them separately, but I want you to describe to me what the study would look like if you were using a cross-sectional design or if you were using a longitudinal design, but I want you to do it for all 3 designs in your answer. Okay? And then for the third one, you can take a picture of this on a sheet of paper, or you can create it on your own. What I want you to do in each stage of Piaget's developmental stages, in one column, I want you to list the stage. In the second one, I want you to indicate what a child can do at that stage. And in the third column, I want you to list what a child cannot do at that stage. So your chart should have 3 columns in total, and about 5, if you have a heading, 5 rows of information. Good luck with the exit ticket questions.